been a little fantasy heavy of late, so I wanted a bit of a change of pace, and I thought I would do historical fiction today. And I chose Shogun by James Clavell, which is a classic of not just the historical fiction genre, but also the trashy novel genre. Historical trash. Honestly, one of my favorite hybrid genres. Shogun, when it came out, was basically responsible for kickstarting the Japanese craze in American popular culture in 1975. Literally everybody was on the Japan train, and then a couple of years later it was remade into a miniseries starring Richard Chamberlain, which is batshit. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just insane. This Richard Chamberlain, who is sort of playing an Englishman in the 16th century, but also looks kind of like he's a caveman who just discovered clothes. It's weird. But when it came out, the series had a lot of Japanese that was spoken, and it was sort of touted as a Japanese American series, and they actually went to the trouble of shooting in Japan and finding Japanese actors and all that kind of stuff. So it really informed, I think, an entire generation of Americans' view of what Japan was like, or what historical Japan was like. And I'm going to link down below to a paper that was published out of the University of California, Santa Barbara. And it is a paper that was written by a bunch of academics, of historians who specialize in Japanese history. And it sort of talks about how the novel got a lot of things wrong, and how the miniseries got a lot of things wrong, obviously. But also it got like the major aspects of Japanese culture right. So it's a bit of a mixed bag when you're talking about culture and cultural appropriation and that kind of stuff, but we'll come to that in a little bit. Let's talk about the novel. This was the first book in what is known as Clavell's Asian Saga. Even though the Asian Saga is not really connected to each other, I think the Noble House in Taipan and all of that is connected, but this particular novel is not really connected to any of the other novels. It just gets lumped in together because I guess it's all set in Asia. I love 20th century marketing. So pure, so oblivious. But Shogun is a novel that is set in 1600 Japan, and it's the story of an English ship navigator called John Blackthorne, who arrives in Japan in order to break Catholic Portugal's hold on the trade with Japan. So the entire backstory is about how Elizabethan England has just beaten the Spanish Armada, and Protestant England is at war with Spanish Catholic forces as well as Portuguese Catholic forces. And the Portuguese control the trade with Japan, which is extremely lucrative for them. And the Japanese, being an insular society, don't really know much about Europe or about that part of the world. And the little that they do know leads them to hold it in contempt. And they kind of see Europeans as being dirty and without honor and just weird. And it's based on a real life story. There was a man called William Adams who actually did live a version of John Blackthorne's life in real Japan in the 16th century, and he died in Japan. And Blackthorne, when we first meet him, is definitely a rapacious European who is out for trade, and he just wants to make money, and he doesn't understand why the Japanese won't give him the time of day. And as the novel progresses and he integrates into Japanese culture and he becomes a valued member of the aristocracy who are sort of jostling for position and power in Imperial Japan, and specifically with this character called Toranaga, who is the man who becomes the shogun. And he gets to know Japanese culture and appreciate it and acclimates to it, to a point where at a certain point in the novel he goes back to meet his crew and they're still being European and British and Dutch basically. And he looks at them and he's like, oh my God, is that what the Japanese saw when they saw me for the first time? Because they are filthy and they are sort of animalistic and backward in so many ways compared to how Japanese society functions and how they live. You know, there's an emphasis on hygiene, for example, that the Europeans don't share, and the food that they eat and all these different things. And it's sort of an education of John Blackthorne. And I guess a lot of the defense that people have about Clavell basically writing exotica about Japan is that he elevates Japanese culture as opposed to British culture. And that's not really true because, you know, even within that, what he does is that he plays into that whole stereotype of the fantastic physicality of the white man. So all the Japanese women that John Blackthorne meets are fascinated by his dick, basically. Can't get enough of it. It's so big. It's magic. I swear to God, I'm going to start a playlist and it's going to be called The Magic Healing Deck. And there's a whole bunch of other things that happen as well. You know, there's rampant exoticization of the culture and of things that happened. But it is a novel that has been deeply researched, and Clavell literally is one of those authors who lays out all his research in his book. Not in a way that seems pedantic or takes you out of the plot. So one of the things about trashy novels is that they're very well written and they really draw the interest of the reader, and you sort of get really involved in that world. And that's what Clavell does really well. You know, you start reading and you are immediately within this world from the first page on. Honestly, if you read the first chapter and you're not really into it, then this book is not for you. There's also a bunch of threads about Christianity in Japan and how it's affecting the local culture and how people are reacting to it, and how the arrival of Blackthorne and his Dutch comrades basically throws a spanner into the works of the Jesuits who are there already, and reveals to the Japanese that Christianity is not a monolith, and there are Protestants and there are Catholics, and the two are at war. And there are all these political games that are being played, a lot of which Blackthorne doesn't understand because it's Japanese politics and it's labyrinthine and it's complicated, and you don't really understand until you see the POV of the Japanese characters. And that's a really effective way to do it, because you're with Blackthorne and you're just like, why are these people being so bloody? And then you see the Japanese POV and they're like, well, we're trying to save his dumb ass because he doesn't know what he's saying or doing. He's just this giant blundering white whale with a giant dick. Clavell also does a really good job of drawing out the emotions of all the characters. So, you know, even though you are kind of looking down on some of the things that Blackthorne and his cohort are doing, because you understand where they're coming from, you know, there are colonizers, and you know how that story progressed in other parts of Asia and how the Japanese were 100% right to kick them out of Japan and to know that they were bad news. But at the same time, you see the emotions of these people and they're so far away, and it's the 1600s and there's no easy way for them to get back to where they come from. And Blackthorne especially has these moments where he is looking at the Japanese women, and especially his lovers in Japan. There's this fantastic character of Lady Mariko, who is a Christian woman but also Japanese and is sort of caught between cultures. And he's looking at these women and he is thinking about the wife and child that he left behind in England, and he is furious because he sees what good hygiene and a good diet can do for women, and it seems like such a silly tiny thing, but is so specific to how men really don't understand how tiny things can affect larger things in life. Now, this is 100% the kind of novel that would never be published today, because literally all of social media will just pick it apart. But that being said, I would actually really love it if somebody from Japan, for instance, wrote a book about Elizabeth in England. And it was about a Japanese person who ends up in England and is sort of re-educated about how to live and ends up helping Queen Elizabeth do things. Why don't we ever see that story? I would really like to see that. A bit of role reversal. So should you read Shogun? I think yes, you should. It is pretty well researched and there are things in there that might be a bit grisly. There are scenes of torture, for example, that are a bit much. A person literally gets boiled alive, for instance, and that's within the first 100 pages of the book. And there's definitely this feeling that the Japanese are really bloodthirsty and they're really into elaborate forms of murder. So if you're a Japanese person and you come across this video, do let me know if you think that's real. But as far as trashy books go and as far as historical trash goes, this is definitely A-list content. There's a reason why this book sold like 15 million copies or something. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.